Welcome to What's What with Heather Harris, the podcast for the fiercely hopeful. Here, we explore the lesser-known innovations, overlooked ideas, and hidden forces quietly shaping our human experience. I'm your host, Heather Harris. Let's find out what's what. Courage is a human quality that many of us admire, but from a distance. We discover it when we have to place ourselves in vulnerable and uncertain situations, like a big job interview or facing a major life change. But we are not often required to purposefully move toward danger when every instinct is screaming to turn and run. My guest is John Volanthen, one of the world's most accomplished cave rescue divers. He is the author of 13 Lessons That Saved 13 Lives, the Thai Cave Rescue. You might have first heard of John in 2018 when young footballers and their coach became trapped during what was meant to be a fun day out in Tham Luang cave in Thailand. But monsoon had started early, and with little warning, the team were blindsided by a rapid flooding of the cave's tunnel network, stranding them on a remote underground beach. John and fellow British cave diver Rick Stanton were the first to reach them, and most notably confirmed that they were indeed still alive when despair had already settled in for their safe return. John has been in many similar situations, with the burden of anxious family members and the scrutiny of the media upon him. But he has demonstrated time and again when the pressure spikes, when the risk mounts, he responds. He steps forward when most would step back. There is compelling evidence that people in high-risk professions don't just steel themselves and forge ahead into dangerous situations. They develop skills and strengths to remain calm. They adapt to the situation and execute their tasks despite the personal risk. So today with John, we're exploring fortitude and resiliency as trainable skills. How do people prepare, visualize, make clean decisions, and stay present in the middle of chaos? And how can we adopt that mindset when life gets hard? Let's get into it. Hello, John. Thank you so much for joining me today and having a conversation about your latest book and your adventures cave diving. For the listeners who are meeting you for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a renowned cave diver?
Hi, Heather. It's nice to be here. Renowned is a strange word. I think perhaps notorious might be better. Also something that was intentional. My interest for a long time has been in caves, in the underground world. I started caving as a boy in the Scouts. And I really enjoyed being underground. I've never been any good at ball sports, so football or cricket was never my thing. And I just found that I was at home underground. I like the physicality of moving through caves. And at a fairly early age, about 14, I think, with the Scouts, I was taken to a particular cave in the southwest of the UK. And we reached a flooded section of passage. And the trip leader kind of said to us that it was impossible to continue. And I don't know why, but as a young boy, that kind of sparked my interest. And I made a promise to myself at that moment that I would come back to that place and I would learn the skills to be able to continue in that place underwater. And so that's really where my interest in caving and cave diving came from. I guess as I grew older, I became more interested in cave exploration. So finding and mapping and charting cave that nobody's been to before. And the way I did that was by diving underwater in flooded sections and trying to find a continuation in caves. And it was a skill I kind of developed. And I almost accidentally became quite good at it, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's really about problem solving. And so for years, cave exploration was my thing, and it's a very niche activity. And that's why I kind of laughed at the word renowned. Cavers, caving, cave diving is not something that's particularly well known throughout the world. It was a very small group of us, and we were quite successful in exploring lots of caves in the UK, in Europe, and much further afield. And then what led on from that was a responsibility, really. Cave rescue is all about cavers looking after each other. We are the only people with the expertise to go into that environment. And so from a selfish point of view, you hope that if you're stuck somewhere, that your colleagues, your friends will come and find you and help you. And so to me, it's only right that I became involved in cave rescue, most often cave diving rescue, because that was where my expertise lay. And cave diving rescue and cave exploration are very similar skill sets. It's all about problem solving. And I guess as we go along, I'll come back to talking about solving problems. I eventually became involved in a number of cave rescues and cave diving rescues around the world, and one of which was the Tham Luang cave rescue in Thailand, where the 12 children and their coach were stuck in a flooded cave. And myself and my dive partner, Rick Stanton, were asked to assist, and we were able to eventually find the boys. And after a fairly protracted period of time, we were able to safely bring them out. So that's been the event that has perhaps been most notable to the world, but it was certainly an interesting few weeks.
Wow, that's putting it mildly. I mean, that was just across every media channel around the globe. I remember it myself. I think the whole world was on the edge of their seats. And to be the center of it and actually have the responsibility and the burden of those lives on your shoulders and relying on that skill set that you've developed over the years must have been something else. So you wrote this book, 13 Lessons That Saved 13 Lives, the inside story of the Thai cave rescue. And it not only chronicles the outstanding rescue of these young footballers and their coach from the cave system in Chiang Rai, but it blends the tale with very salient lessons that you've learned over the course of your life doing this work. So why did you structure the book in this way? You could have just written the story, but instead you've included these really interesting lessons.
So I, for years, have been involved in my day job, which is information technology. I work as a network engineer, and I've worked with lots of different engineers and groups of people in sometimes what can be quite high stress situations. You often hear, "Oh, the network's gone down," or "the server's gone down," and the poor people in the background that are trying to fix it are under immense pressure, because quite often minutes is quite expensive. And I realized over the years that for me, that there was a transfer both ways of techniques and knowledge. So I was able to take some of the structured problem solving that I'd learned from work and apply that to exploring caves, kind of the what ifs and the what do I do and how do I solve problems. But I was also able to take a lot of the more perhaps soft or human factors type techniques from being underground and in what's sometimes in quite a stressful or frightening situation, and apply that back into my workplace. And I didn't initially want to write a book about the Thai cave rescue. There were a number of books that were available, but what I've always wanted to do is to try and crystallize and to share some of that knowledge and to try and offer that to, I guess, the wider public, both in everyday life and also in the workplace. And so the Thai cave rescue presented me with an opportunity, essentially a story from which to hang those lessons, hopefully to make them interesting and memorable. We all know that we remember things that are emotionally charged. And so an event that occurred with children in danger, people tend to remember, as you originally suggested, it was all over the media. And so using that event, I've been able to write a book, which also gives some hopefully interesting examples from my exploration career and illustrates the lessons and how they apply both in everyday life, how I learnt the lesson and how it was often applied, sometimes in high stress situations, particularly in Thailand.
Mm-hmm. I'm very grateful for the lessons you put forward because they are applicable to every life. We all encounter high stress situations from one time to another, sometimes unexpectedly. So through the rescue, ultimately, thank goodness it was successful. You recounted some of your hits and misses along the way. And I love how you frame success and failure as hits and misses. So what can this reframing teach us?
I think cave diving is quite, for me, an interesting activity in that it's often peppered with the feeling of failure, especially with exploration. Because if you turn round and you make it back to the surface safely, clearly you could have gone further. So when you survive, you often have this sense, oh, I should have just gone that bit further, or I should have tried just that bit harder. But of course, you've got to make sure you stay on the safe side of the line, in inverted commas, because when you tip over the other side, that's the moment you don't come back. So I've spent a lot of time perhaps feeling like a failure. That's a personal sense. I'm perhaps my harshest critic. Others wouldn't necessarily see it that way, where I've thought, oh, I should have gone that bit further. So I think it's kind of important to be realistic about what you're trying to achieve in any moment. And lots of things that we consider to be a miss are often just learning points on a way to going further. Cave diving's clearly an extreme example, but you might have not quite gone as far as you could, but you've learned a lot, you've gained some experience, and hopefully you're expanding your comfort zone. I think in society today, we try and always be comfortable. That's something we're sort of taught. You don't want to be outside of your comfort zone because it feels out of control. And to a certain extent, it is. But the only way that you become more capable is by trying to step out of that comfort zone. And sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable. And I have a phrase that I quite like, which is comfortably uncomfortable. It's getting used to that sense of being uncomfortable, but not in danger. I'm not suggesting anyone goes and hangs off a cliff without a rope or anything quite so reckless, but maybe it's standing up in front of people and talking. Maybe it's presenting at a board meeting. Maybe it's just even offering your opinion to a group of people when it's not necessarily asked for, but you've got something that you're sure is worth saying. But that being uncomfortable, to me, is a hit. That's a really good thing because you're both practicing being uncomfortable and also expanding that comfort zone. And I think that's a really important skill that we quite often don't teach our youths or even our adults. And I'm still involved in the Scouts, and I still take Scouts caving, where you're trying to deliberately expand people's comfort zones and show them that being slightly uncomfortable isn't necessarily the disaster with which it may appear.
Yeah, I think that's where growth lives, right? We have to push our boundaries a little bit to engage more in the world, to learn. And yes, maybe we don't push it as far as we'd like, and maybe we feel that we haven't exactly reached our potential in that moment. But as you say, maybe that's just a step along the journey.
I agree that in my life, there have been a great many moments where I've not achieved what I wanted to. But that first attempt was somewhere where I gathered information, and something that was sometimes that was even gathering information about me, about how I feel, and about how I'm able to cope in a situation. And I can come back a second or a third, or sometimes many times, and gradually you can achieve what you're looking to achieve. Absolutely, that's where growth happens.
As you say, I think it's so critical that we pass this along to our younger generations. I'm thrilled to hear that you're still involved with the Scouts because that's where your love of cave diving originated. But it's something that we really have to encourage with our our young people, taking calculated risks and educated risks actually can lead to a great positivity in their lives.
I would go further. I would say it's essential for life. If we don't take any risks, then ultimately we create more trouble by trying to keep ourselves and our youth safer. I always talk about, again, it's a really small example, but if you never teach a child to cross a road, if you never give them the responsibility, then ultimately they grow up to be an adult that can't cross a road, which is actually really dangerous.
Yeah, yeah.
So that should always be done, as you suggest, controlled and with thought. But it's absolutely essential.
I agree with you. I found myself holding my breath while listening to you recount some of the more dangerous and risky rescues and explorations that you've been involved in. And you speak about the importance of breath in these pages, but also another technique you talk about I found so valuable. Can you tell me about the 3-second, 3-minute, and 3-hour time slicing that's been essential to maintaining your own calm in these high-stakes situations?
Yes, diving is, as you suggest, often breath-related because your breathing is really important. If you're breathing off a normal open-circuit cylinder, the speed at which you breathe absolutely governs how long you can stay underwater. And for different equipment, that has similar important ramifications. It's a good way of trying to keep calm. Lots of meditation techniques focus on breath work. And I kind of came to that almost accidentally. I realized focusing on breath was quite a good thing as a diver, but it is something that I try and do in difficult situations, even on dry land. I think it's a good way of grounding myself in my body. What I have found, though, is I can reach a point where the stress is beginning to mount, and I almost find that as a physical sensation. I can feel it starting in my stomach and sort of rising towards my chest. It's that knot in your stomach, and I tend to deal with that head on. I don't think it's something that you can ignore, because for me, if I let it go, that's what would rise up, and that's what ultimately becomes panic. And panic is when you start making bad decisions, when you start doing things and actions that you perhaps can't undo. Mm-hmm. And I try and acknowledge that I'm starting to get stressed. And my IT brain, again, working with computers, I tend to think of myself, I've got a certain amount of capacity. We're all used to seeing on our computer, it tells you how busy the processor is. And for me, if I think that I'm becoming really stressed, sometimes that stress starts to use that capacity that you have. And the way that I try and reduce that is I try and stop thinking about the things that aren't important. And what I aim to do is I start thinking about the next 3 seconds. And for me, underwater, that's usually making sure that I know where my next breath is coming from. Does the breathing regulator in my mouth work? Do I know exactly where my spare breathing regulator is in case the first one fails? That means that I can guarantee that I'm going to survive the next 3 seconds and hopefully calm down a little bit. And if that seems to be manageable, if there's not too much stress, then I might think about my immediate surroundings and perhaps the next 3 minutes. So what I'm trying to do underwater, can I see where I'm going, which direction I'm trying to go in the cave? I might look at the contents gauges on my diving cylinders, but I'm really thinking about my immediate surroundings, nothing beyond perhaps a few feet in front of me and a few feet behind. And if that seems to be manageable, if I've calmed down enough to cope with that, then I might think about the bigger, scarier stuff, perhaps the next 3 hours. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is quite often, what am I trying to achieve while I'm actually underground and underwater? And more importantly, how am I going to get myself out of the cave? Sometimes that idea where you're feeling a long way underground, you're feeling a long way from the surface and safety, that's what's overwhelming. So you have to ignore that and think about the next 3 minutes. and sometimes drop to the next 3 seconds. So for me, the idea of slicing a problem or your situation into timeframes is to try and reduce the stress to a manageable size that you can actually cope with. It's, again, a way of making hopefully good decisions. And then as you begin to relax, you can start to look at a bigger and bigger picture. It's looking at the problems that you can solve and trying to solve those without being overwhelmed by the overall situation, which can sometimes be quite scary.
I can only imagine how scary. But I think this is something that this really resonated with me because it's something that can be applied to any stressful situation. It's about compartmentalizing what is immediately necessary to address, and then the larger picture, which can be very overwhelming, then somehow seems to be more manageable because you've addressed, the smaller, more accessible tasks.
It does. And also, if you change the timeframes, it starts to be a lot more applicable. So as an organization with a sales target for a year, it might seem almost impossible on the 1st of January. I can't imagine how we're going to reach that sales target. But if you start breaking it down to quarterly or monthly, and then even smaller into what actions do I need to do now? What phone calls do I need to make now? What emails do I need to send? Just to start moving towards the goal that you're trying to achieve. Sometimes that big goal is just too big and scary to even contemplate starting. So looking at your situation and breaking it down into those small actions that you can imagine how you're going to do and that you can repeat is a good way of starting to move towards an impossible target. And when you get to 97%, that last 3% seems a lot more manageable than perhaps the first 3%.
Yeah, it just helps you take that first step towards achieving that goal.
It's just trying to make potentially a stressful situation as manageable as possible. And it's a strategy. Sometimes just having the strategy is enough to make the situation feel less overwhelming.
Yeah. So in your book, the phrase, "it will be all right," comes up. Now, on the surface, people think they may understand what that phrase means, but what does it mean to you, John?
I'm a great believer in disassociation. I think that's quite a good way, again, of dealing with a situation. If you almost look at yourself or imagine that you're looking at yourself from outside your body, then you're not necessarily as intimately involved in that situation, and it's not as scary as perhaps it might be, because you're looking at it from perhaps slightly removed and slightly away from the stress and in the case of cave diving, the danger. And I try and imagine that I'm listening. And when I say to myself, "it'll be all right," and what I mean by that is it's where you might perhaps be sloppy, or you might leave something. It's like where you leave the banana skin on the stairs, for instance, and you think, "I'll clear that up later. It'll be fine. It'll be all right." Whenever I hear that phrase, whenever I hear myself say that phrase in my own mind, I try and stop and I try and think, no, it won't be. This is something I need to address, because most problems, difficulties, accidents, whatever you want to call difficult situations, it's never usually one thing that goes wrong. It's usually a cascade of small things. You've only got to say, "it'll be all right. I won't fill the car up with petrol or fuel or what have you. It'll be all right. I'll give myself 5 minutes less to get to the train station." And then all of these things mount up, and suddenly you find yourself in a situation that you really don't want to be in. So whenever I hear myself saying, "it'll be all right," and I say it really quickly, really flippantly, just to myself, thinking in my own mind, I try and stop, and I try and think, is this something I should really deal with? Is this something that's really going to be all right? Or is it an issue that's going to come back and potentially bite me later? Because it's not the one thing that'll cause you the problem. On its own, it is probably all right. But life is a is a series of events, and often missing several of those things can really come back to bite you later. Another model that has been suggested to me in the past is what's called the incident pit, where it's not one problem that causes you the trouble. You step a little bit down into the pit, and the sides of the pit get steeper as you get towards trouble. And so every step that you take towards trouble is harder to climb back out again.
Oh, that's interesting.
Much like the nose of a trumpet or a trombone. It starts nice and shallow, but as you get closer to where the sound comes out, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And so on the outside, where there's only one problem, in inverted commas, and the metal in the case of a trombone or a trumpet is really shallow, it's easy to correct. But by the time you've ignored 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things, they all might be innocuous things, but they all add up, and it becomes harder and harder to correct the problem to avoid ultimately falling into that pit. So the phrase "it'll be all right" is, for me, is I try and use as a warning, especially if I'm in a situation that I know has high consequences, such as cave diving. And whenever I hear myself say that, I try and stop and say, is this a moment where I should actually turn around and go out? Can I solve the problem? Or is it something I'm prepared to accept and continue? And that's a judgment. But it's important to me to make that judgment. It's not an unconscious situation where I'm just wandering on into the darkness, hoping it'll be all right.
Yeah, I don't think I would like to find myself wandering into a cave at the depths that you have been, just assuming that things will be all right. Actually, this particular lesson has made me think very differently when that phrase crosses my mind, or even when I hear other people say it. It is a bit of a warning. It is a bit of a clue that perhaps there are details that need to be examined further. And as you say, maybe it will be fine, but err on the side of caution.
I think that's it. It's making a conscious decision. Sometimes we perform actions and we make decisions without actually realizing that we've made a decision. So for me, it's a flag, and it's a way of saying, okay, am I actually making a decision here? Is this something that I need to either address or accept?
Yeah, because that presence of mind has to be absolutely critical when you are in these very high stakes, high pressure, dangerous situations. Certainly, you must be very conscious of every decision, I would imagine, as you're going
and in
through
everyday life.
And in everyday life, walking down the street, crossing the road, as you say, we need to be aware, right? We can't be looking at our mobile phones and thinking, oh, it'll be all right. I'll just step off the curb right now.
Now, there's an interesting subject. The number of people that I see out in just walking around the town or the streets who literally have no idea where they are. They're quite often looking at a mobile phone and often have headphones on, as big
and headphones,
noise cancelling headphones, and I find that really interesting. It's an interesting survival technique, shall we say, or lack thereof.
I think it's the opposite of a survival technique. They're in like sensory deprivation, and they're lucky to make it through the day, really.
There are times and places for those things, but that's another story.
Yes, maybe sitting comfortably in your own sitting room would be the best place for that. So your partner, Rick Stanton, and yourself, you have been through so many adventures together. At one point in the rescue of this football team, you were losing hope. Can you tell me how you emotionally managed to move through that and continue with your efforts? Did you have to lean on each other at that time?
What we did was to pause. So a lot of what I talk about is about action. I admit that I'm generally skewed in my approach towards doing something rather than not doing something. I don't generally like inaction, but I have come up with a phrase that I've called actively inactive. And what I mean by that is making a decision to pause. It's often a good thing to do nothing, but the reason you're doing nothing is important. And what we chose to do when we lost hope was actually to take ourselves away from the situation. We actually went and did half a day of tourism around a temple to just take ourselves away from the pressure and really stop thinking about a situation that at that moment we couldn't affect. At that point, diving had been banned in the cave by the Thai Navy SEALs. They wouldn't let us in the cave. There was literally nothing we could do. And we feared that we would be sat around potentially for a very long period of time and possibly used as scapegoats, possibly just sat around until a body recovery was required. So being there didn't actually serve any purpose. So we removed ourselves from that situation just to try and take the pressure off a little bit. And when we came back, the situation had changed, and we felt that it was time again to start, and we perhaps started afresh. I think this was one of the key lessons for me. Normally, in any rescue situation, you're looking for certainty, but there was a lot of uncertainty at that moment, and removing ourselves from the situation was something that gave us perhaps a little bit of perspective.
Yeah, and a little piece from the chaos, because it was I'm sure a very chaotic scene with all of I mean, how many rescuers were on site? It was madness.
There was certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved in all sorts of different capacities, and the rescue effort extended quite a long way away from the cave just to sustain that number of people in terms of sanitation, in terms of food, all sorts of things. It was
Right.
it was a very big and chaotic operation.
And that's going to influence how you're feeling about the whole situation, and not being able to even access the cave or take action, as you say, must have been, I don't know, was it frustrating? Did that also lead you to want to take that pause?
It was certainly frustrating, but it was the moment to make a decision to pause. We weren't inactive out of fear of making a choice. It was a conscious decision to
Be
step
inactive.
away, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important. That's another very important lesson in life. Sometimes it is necessary to take a step back, reassess, ground yourself, calm your nervous system, and then, as you say, start afresh and have a better game plan.
And I've seen that in my work life many times, where sometimes you can't see the solution to a problem, but when you pause, step away from the problem, maybe it's a cup of coffee, maybe it's overnight. It depends on the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve. But that little bit of distance sometimes gives you the perspective, and then you can't imagine how you couldn't see the solution before, because it's
That's
so
right. Yeah. I always feel a cup of tea. It really, that helps. Stepping back, having a cup of tea makes everything look a little bit more rosy.
That's very English.
It is very English, but I am Canadian, so it's Commonwealth. I figure, I can claim it too.
Close enough. Definitely.
One of the most touching moments of the rescue was when you realized that the boys and their coach were alive, and coming from your scout heritage, you led them in a cheer to buoy their moods and their spirits. What inspired you at that moment?
When I find myself in a situation that is completely out of my experience or comfort zone, what I try and do is I look back for what I call the library of plans. In my mind, often this isn't written down. For some things, such as cave rescue, there are formalized plans and so on. But as a life skill, I look through my mind for the closest situation that I've ever encountered. And then I see if I can apply that situation. I might have to change what I'm doing, but I'm trying to pick something that's as close to my experience as possible. And finding the boys in that moment, I found myself in a situation that I'd never encountered, that I never expected to encounter. and I really didn't know what to do. And so I had a quick look back through my mind, my library of plans, and I thought, I don't know how to treat Thai children, but I do know how to cope with scouts, young children. And so I thought about essentially the scout tradition of a campfire, where we sing and chant and so on. And that's always something that the scouts come away from buoyed and happy. And I also thought that I wanted to try and bring out of the cave something that would hopefully motivate the rescuers. And so I decided, and it felt a little bit over the top at the time, but I decided to get the football team, the Thai children, to chant or to cheer, essentially, for all of the groups that I could remember that were outside the cave. And so I tried to get them on the camera to give a cheer for all of the nationalities and the groups that were there to rescue them. One of the things I felt at the time was I wanted to give them an impression that it wasn't just Rick and myself that had turned up. I wanted to try and give them a sense that there was this large machine or group of people that were there trying to save them. I'm not sure, having now watched the video back, that sense actually came across. I think they would have cheered for anybody or anything that I asked them to.
Perhaps.
It certainly worked in terms of getting them together and also giving them a sense that something had changed. That was the other thing I was trying to create. I was trying to get a sense that something was different. They'd been sat in relative silence for 10 days in almost darkness. Now there was light, and hopefully it was time to raise their spirits. But for me, it was a case of looking back through that library of plans and picking the closest situation that I'd found myself in, because I was well and truly out of my comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an experience that I think very many people ever would encounter in their lives. So now you have to expand on the library of plans. When I heard you speak about this in the audiobook, I thought, oh, I've got to have my own library of plans, because it's a resource, an internal resource that you can call on in any given situation. And it certainly helped you in this. So can you explain a little bit about what the library of plans is?
It's just a way for me to perhaps, again, address situations that I'm not particularly comfortable with. It's a way of trying to assemble my life experience, perhaps, into a way that is useful. We've all been through adversity of various types, some more than others. And the fact that we're still here means in some way we were able to cope with those. Mm-hmm. So perhaps it's a way of trying to organize some of that really good experience. And when we find ourselves out of our comfort zone, we find ourselves faced with a situation that we can't contemplate a solution for. It's a case for me of saying, what's the closest situation I've ever been to this? Mm-hmm. It might not be directly applicable. I'm going to take that situation or that solution, and then I'm going to modify it so that it's appropriate to the situation I find myself in. The theory being, if I'm picking a working solution and changing it, hopefully it's only the changes that I might get wrong.
Right.
When you're under stress, it's very easy again to make bad decisions, or it's hard to be creative. But if you're trying to if you're trying to come up with a solution, if you pick something that you know works, modify it as little as possible, then hopefully you might get some of those changes wrong, but the basic idea is hopefully on the right lines. And you created that basic idea and you've thought about it over a period of time, and when you're hopefully not so stressed. So it's a way of taking something that's known, working and good, and applying it to a situation that it may be hard to be creative in that moment.
Right. And this kind of leads into your belief in visualization. You visualize what ifs, in many, many different environments and potentialities. You've even visualized having to retrieve Rick Stanton, your dive partner's body, in a potential situation. And I'm sure he didn't think that was a wonderful scenario for you to think out. But visualization has had real practical application in your life, and it has helped you in many, many different and dire situations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I am a great believer in visualization, but perhaps not in the traditional sense. We're quite often taught, if we're in a race, to visualize ourselves as we cross the finish line, arms in the air, perhaps success, winning, holding the cup, or whatever the trophy or the prize. So that's positive visualization, and there is value in that. But I've tended to use visualization very differently. I've tended to visualize sometimes procedures that I have to go through, where if on a particular dive I have to go through a sequence of events, I'll rehearse those events physically, but also I may imagine them many times so that I'm much more familiar with them. Mm-hmm. But I also perform what I call negative visualization. And I don't know that this is something that's done very much. And there is a reason why, and I'll come to that in a second. But I do think through difficult situations that I may encounter. I think through how I'm going to feel. And I also try and remember the difficulties from previous situations. Because when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, again, that uncomfortable feeling, if it's familiar, if you can think, okay, I've been through this, or I've imagined what was going to happen, mm-hmm. Hopefully it's not so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. It's a way of perhaps case hardening yourself for situations that you know are going to occur. Again, this is an emotive point. Ultimately, we're all going to lose parents at various points in our lives. And it always amazes me when people find it a complete surprise, because it was something that was absolutely inevitable. I'm not saying it's pleasant. I'm not saying it's not incredibly difficult, but it is something that certainly I've thought about. I've lost one parent. I've got one very elderly mother now. And mm-hmm. I do think through a little bit, how is this going to feel, to try and prepare myself? But I think there is a flip side to this, which is, for me, I can take it so far and then stop. If you continue, it sort of falls into what I would call catastrophizing, which is where we can traumatize ourselves, we can over worry and then feel those emotions for things that may never happen. That's the other way that can go. So it is important, and again, it's not an easy thing to do, but thinking about those things to a degree where you can perhaps start to prepare yourself for the emotions you're going to feel, but not to a degree where you're going to cause yourself worry or problem mm-hmm. in the short term. I suppose, as an example, it's a little bit like taking a vaccine rather than catching a cold, if you're
yes,
the expression. That's, I know, again, there are pros and cons of that these days, but that's the intention. It's a way of thinking about difficulties and emotions to a point where you're able to cope with them, mm-hmm. rather than a point where they're going to cause you difficulties.
It's more like preparation, as opposed to catastrophizing, as you're saying, like worrying about the absolute worst outcome. Although I would say potentially in cave diving, you do really have to consider the worst possible outcome and maybe backtrack from that. And what are the steps you take to avoid those outcomes? So I can see the value of negative, as you put it, visualization, particularly in that realm.
In any dangerous activity, you have to truly accept how dangerous something is in order to act in a way that is hopefully going to avoid those dangers.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen a number of friends, colleagues who haven't survived cave diving, who've sadly died. And it's not unusual where in our community or peer group, fairly new cave divers stop diving at that point because they didn't actually really truly accept that this is a dangerous activity. They didn't truly accept this could happen to them. And seeing it happen to a friend or a colleague, it suddenly brings it home that this really is a dangerous activity. But the same applies to driving.
Yes.
If you don't accept what could happen at 70 miles an hour if you roll the car in the rain or whatever the accident you might choose to think about is, then you can't actually behave in a way that is hopefully defensive. You might find yourself still piling down the freeway or the motorway in the rain at a fast speed, using your phone, whatever it is. Unless you actually accept how potentially dangerous an activity is, you can't act in a way that will hopefully prevent those dangers. So what we're talking about isn't as macabre or pessimistic as it sounds. It's a way of trying to understand how dangerous something is and then acting accordingly to prevent that outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love the analogy with driving because I have to tell you, I see so many people who I don't think have assumed or recognized the risks that they take when they get behind the wheel of a car. So there are a lot of what ifs, as we've kind of touched on in our conversation, when you're entering a cave or, in the course of daily life, they're unavoidable. How do you deal with the emotional aftermath of such highly charged experiences? I mean, the Thai cave rescue, I don't know if you would say that was the most emotionally charged experience that you've had in terms of cave rescue, but it certainly was one of the most public and publicly documented. How do you deal with the aftermath of that? I mean, it was very positive, but there was a lot of stress.
During the event, I try and imagine a box. So this is perhaps more visualization. I try and imagine a box in front of me, and I put my emotions in that box for the period of time that I'm trying to deal with the situation. It's a way of trying to make unemotional and good decisions, because emotional decisions are usually, in problem solving terms, bad ones. Perhaps not human relationships, but certainly if you're trying to solve a problem, emotional decisions aren't ideal. So I try to take a step back, put my emotions in that box, and then deal with what I find as unemotionally as possible. And that works for me for a relatively short period of time, perhaps days, possibly extending to weeks if necessary. But what I do afterwards, and I do it quietly in my own time, is I kind of take that box back off the shelf and I peek in it a little bit. Again, perhaps in the way that you might let the pressure out of a fizzy drink. Slowly open the lid or the lid of the box, just have a peek in there and just see if there's anything in there that I need to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
What I've found over the years, some of the events that I've attended, often body recoveries, the outcome hasn't been particularly positive, but there was nothing that I could do to affect those events. Sometimes the outcome was determined before we even received a call for help. And so I've realized that as long as I'm comfortable with my actions, that I can put the events to bed afterwards and perhaps move on from there. So rather than being wedded to the outcome of an event that often I couldn't necessarily affect, I try and make sure that I look at the actions that I took. And sometimes there are lessons to learn from those, and that's okay. That's the nature of life. But really, it's for me, it's about being comfortable with those actions. And then I can say, okay, I did all that I could. There was no mistakes that were made. If there were, there need to be lessons. But really, then I can put that event to bed and hopefully move on.
That's a very balanced and healthy approach, I think. And especially looking at any actions that you took that maybe were less than what could have affected a better outcome as lessons, as things to learn from for the next time or to put in your library of plans. I think that's what we have to do. We can't look at failures and then self-flagellate or misses and, be very hard on ourselves. We have to look at these things as lessons.
I agree. But if there's stuff that I feel that I should have done better, I'll take that lesson on my chin. I think I said earlier, I'm my own worst critic. The way I judge myself is probably far harsher than the way others judge me, and that's okay. That's for me. That's how I learn, and that's how I try and be better next time.
Well, I think it's reflected in the level of expertise that you have, and the success that you have enjoyed, and that others have benefited from in the course of your rescues and all of the recovery operations that you've been involved in. During the course of this particular rescue and other rescues, your life, what is the one thing that you've learned about hope that surprises you, even when the odds are slim?
Hope is an interesting word, isn't it? I think it's used in lots of ways. I'm not really sure what is meant by hope. I thought about this quite a lot. What I do think is that it's important to recognise what we as an individual, so one of perhaps 7 billion people, that's a tiny cog in what's an unbelievably, unimaginably large machine or planet. But I think it's worth recognising that the benefit and the positivity and the difference that us as individuals can make. I think it's easy to think that the world is too big, the system is too huge. As individuals, we can make a difference. Even when you can't see a path or a way through, those positive actions, they do mount. They are important. And sometimes, metaphorically, you have to beat your head against the wall in order to come out the other side, perhaps. But I think, as a concept, hope is a strange thing. But it's important to remember that we, as individuals, we're valuable, and that we can make a difference. We can always make a difference.
That is brilliant. This is a remarkable book. It is a book that I recommend everybody read because you will take away multiple strategies, life strategies that are very positive and very helpful. And they come from this remarkable life that you are living, John. So what is next for you, and how can our listeners find and follow your adventures?
I think in lots of ways I've been lucky, but in other ways I've perhaps made some of that luck. So I've had a lot of opportunities, but I've also been able to grasp those opportunities and move forwards with them. So what's next for me is, as I've mentioned, I'm a great believer and advocate with the Scouts, not just in caving, but across the board as well. I think it's a fantastic organisation. It's something I'm proud to be involved with, and that certainly will continue. I'm still involved in cave exploration, often abroad these days. The weather in the UK seems to be continually rainy, so
no surprise there.
Well, there's still exploration going on, and again, I'm still involved with that, and I'm still enjoying other pursuits. I had always on my list to take up paragliding, and that's something I've been doing for a relatively short period of time, a couple of years, and it's been quite interesting coming back to an activity as a novice and having to start to learn again. All of those things that I've talked about in terms of being outside your comfort zone, in terms of trying to expand that comfort zone, build skills and so on. That's been a really interesting process for me. I'm not a particularly prolific poster on social media. I quite often find that for me, the camera is the straw that breaks the camel's back. I'm too busy trying to stay upright or alive to do too much YouTubing or TikToking or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I'm not necessarily particularly public in what I do, but I think for me, the most important thing is that involvement with the Scouts. It's a good way for me of reminding myself what it was like to be young and hopefully not becoming too old and crusty.
Well, I think that's a good method of staving off the old and crusty times. Paragliding too. That's got to keep you young, John. That's a pretty youthful pursuit.
We can only hope.
Well, thank you so much. I am going to put a link to the Scouts organization in my show notes as well. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I absolutely loved your book. I hope that all of my listeners take the opportunity to read it. There are real gems in there. I wish you all the best. I hope that we will speak again sometime.
Thank you, Heather. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining me on What's What with Heather Harris. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find their way here, because the more the merrier. The future is something that we influence and imagine together. I'm Heather Harris, and until next time, stay curious and stay fiercely hopeful.